Hello, everybody. You are watching Passion Project, and I'm your host, Kat Margulis. And on today's show, I have author Farah Heron, author of Accidentally Engaged and the Chai Factor. Yes, I got that right. I'm thinking latte. Hi, Farah. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Kat. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, great to see you. I always love how colorful your photos are, and I love the blue background, and we're both wearing yellow today, so that's awesome.
That's awesome.
So I'm excited to have you on this show, and also because I just learned I had this idea that you were like 20 years old, and then I found out you had a grown son, and so it was cool to hear that you had like a whole life before you became an author. You had different careers in, I think, human resources and psychology, and kind of like me, dare I say it, coming a little bit late to the game, or in my head, that's the story I tell myself. And so I'm curious, like, what took you so long?
Yeah, I definitely a little bit late to the game. I was 39 or 38 when I started writing fiction. And what took me so long is a great question. I ask myself that all the time. I've always been a very I've always loved reading, a very voracious reader, especially as a kid. I was one of those kids that always had like a stack of books under my pillow. So I was always a reader, and I always in the back of my head always wanted to write. But I was afraid. It's kind of scary to take that step towards something that a new creative pursuit. And I didn't know how I would be at it. I always wrote a lot. I used to have a blog back when everybody had a blog, and I loved writing in my blog all the time. It was actually a sewing blog, which people find really funny that I used to have a sewing blog. And then I would write for my job a lot, psychology especially. There tends to be a lot of writing, reports, and things like that. And then, of course, in school. So I always actually enjoyed writing, but not fiction. And then when I was in my 30s, I kind of went through a difficult time with some medical stuff. And after I was pulling out of that, I really turned to books to kind of help me distract me from all this crap that was going on. And after I was kind of coming out of that trauma, of that difficult period for medical issues, I came out of it. I'm like, I don't know why I'm not doing the thing that in the back of my head I've always wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, when you read so much, at least my brain starts thinking of stories of myself, or I would have done it like that, or this is how I would have written it. So I decided to just try and just see what happens. And it was just supposed to be a hobby, and it wasn't supposed to go anywhere. And I just wanted to see if I could. But I don't do anything halfway. When I tend to have like a revolving door of hobbies. And so I don't do it halfway. So I immersed myself in it. I started reading every craft book. I joined Toronto Romance Writers before I was done my first manuscript. So literally it was literally a month after I started writing that I joined. I'm joining this writers group, and my husband's like, already? And I'm like, I'm enjoying it. And I figured the writers group, if anything, it would just kind of keep me on it instead of making me give up on it. So I joined Toronto Romance Writers, and I just kept going at it. And thankfully I write first drafts pretty fast. So I got to write a few terrible ones before I finally had one that I was comfortable with and started submitting to agents.
That's fascinating. So how long does a first draft take you?
So it varies. I say I write pretty fast, but I think I don't think it's that fast anymore. So when I was first starting out, and I had none of that mental stuff that tells me whether this is good or bad. So back then, when I had no inhibitions and just wrote, I could write them really fast. So my favorite story is The Chai Factor. So that was my debut. I wrote the first draft of that in 2 weeks. Wow. Now, the first draft was half of the length at the finished book, so it was very lean and it needed a lot of work. Yeah. But the basic story, I wrote it in 2 weeks, and it was just kind of like a perfect storm of 2 weeks where I had nothing else going on, and I actually had the flu, so I was pretty much in bed and with my computer and just. So it was not a normal 2 weeks in my life, but I was able to get it out really quickly. Now it takes me longer, a couple months usually, to get a first draft.
And how many drafts will you do, and how long will you spend on self-editing?
I do usually 3 drafts two or three drafts before I send it to my beta readers, and then I'll do 2 more drafts, and then it goes to my agent or my editor, wherever I am with that book, whether it needs to go on sub or whether it's just giving to my editor if it's already contracted.
That's awesome. And so when you are writing it, you're not sharing it with anybody. You wait till you have like a completed thing and then they read the whole thing together.
Yeah, I don't work with a critique partner as I go, and I don't even necessarily work with the same, like I'll send it to a beta reader, but it's not always the same person. I have a couple of friends that I switch with. I don't work with the same person during the writing process. I'm very in my head, unless you count my husband, because I bounce ideas off of him all the time. Like he's getting frustrated with me, like, can we just talk about this conflict that I'm having? And then so he knows, but other than the people in my family, I don't share my work until it's done.
This is so fascinating. I'm loving hearing. I haven't talked about this with any of my authors yet, so I'm loving hearing about this. And the beta reader, like, are they necessarily like somebody that you think is gonna? How do you even choose a beta reader? Let's start with that.
Usually it's whoever's willing to read the book, honestly, because I feel like I'm one of these people that always feels like that I'm a huge imposition on people. So I'm like very meekly saying, will you read my book? So it's usually writers who I will switch with. So if somebody asks me to read their book, then I keep it in the back of my head that I read theirs. And then when it's time for me to need a read, then I'll send it to them. All of my beta readers are contracted or published at this point. But they weren't all, like a lot of them are kind of came up through the ranks with me. So they're not like established writers for a long time or anything. And I mean, for the most part, romance, but I think a beta reader doesn't, as long as they're a reader, I don't think they necessarily need to be as tapped into the genre, as long as the genre that I'm writing, as long as they read books. I think a beta reader could help me give the feedback I need.
And they come from writing, so they can give you more of the constructive, technical feedback.
Yeah, exactly. Like if I just gave it to my husband or somebody, a friend, then I don't think the feedback would be as helpful, because they're not really all that. And it's not even that, of course, those people are very nice to me and don't want to hurt me. But it's also that they're not really able to understand why I was bored at this point. While a beta reader will say, your pacing is kind of uneven at the beginning, it's going slower. And so a writer will understand the problems better than a regular reader. At least that's what, in my experience.
That's awesome. That is super, super helpful. I love hearing that. And so yeah, you did your first draft pretty quickly. Did you know at that point to self-edit? Like, I remember when I first started submitting, I'm like, I didn't even know about self-editing.
Yeah.
So, were you already hip to that?
Sort of. Like I said, because I came from writing a lot of not fiction, I did know the process, and I did know what process for me worked, where I would just write something really quickly and then I would go back and revise it for the language to make sure that, because even when I was as opposed to like academic writing or something, when I was writing my blog, I still had my distinctive voice in there. Mm-hmm. So sometimes that voice doesn't come out in your first draft. So I did know that I had to kind of go back to it after writing the first draft. But the other thing that really helped me is the fact that I joined Toronto Romance Writers so quickly. The very first meeting I went to for Toronto Romance Writer was, they do it annually, and it's Romance 101. And basically it's very beginner friendly stuff for people that are just starting to get into romance. So the timing just kind of really worked out for me that happened to be when I joined and when I went for my first meeting. So that Romance 101 literally taught me, this is how you write a book. I mean, not really, this is how you write a book, but basically this is the process. This is how publishing works. I didn't know anything about agents or synopses or queries or anything, but this one-day workshop covered all of that. It didn't tell me how to write those things, but it told me what they were, and it told me what the process is, and it told me what a beta reader is, and it told me all of these things. So that was super, super helpful, because I wouldn't have even known that I didn't know that stuff.
Yeah.
I was lucky that I fell into that right away.
The question of publishing versus self-publishing has been coming up for me a lot in conversations with people lately, and spoke with Lenika about this last week. Did it ever cross your mind to self-publish, or were you always, committed to getting an agent and doing the traditional publishing path?
I didn't know a lot about self-publishing. That first Toronto Romance Writing meeting was very geared towards traditional publishing. But then, of course, the organization has a lot of self-published authors as well as traditionally published. So I met people that were self-published. But I think it didn't really occur to me. Like, I think I would have moved towards self-publishing if the traditional didn't work out, because
Mhm.
especially in romance genre, that's a viable option. Unlike other genres, self-publishing doesn't necessarily hit as well, but in romance, self-publishing, you can be very successful if you're willing to put the work into it.
Mhm.
So I think I would have, but because I had this idea in my head that this is the process. You write a book, you edit a book, you get a beta reader, you edit again, then you send it to an agent. So I had in my head that this is the process of how to write a book. And that is what I did. And then because things kind of fell into place for me, I didn't end up having to look elsewhere. So I'm happy with traditional publishing. I've kind of toyed with self-publishing like short works. I've looked into it like novellas or shorts that I can self-publish in between. But I really don't think it's for me. I don't have that entrepreneurial mindset.
Yeah.
I'm not the kind of person that can really pay attention to my sales enough and figure out if that marketing is working or if I'd rather have everybody else just handle that stuff for me. Like I always say, I'm very, very happy if you just tell me what to do and I'll do it. If my
Yeah.
publicist wants me to do this event, I'll do it. And I have no problem talking and or doing these podcasts or anything. But if you tell me that I have to figure out how and what to do on my own, then I'm lost. It's
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
that's not how my brain works.
Um, and I love like how, you started and you wrote that first draft. How has that changed now that you've got a few books under your belt? You've got, a machine, you've got agents and editors and publishers that you're working with. How has that impacted like your creative process?
Oh, it's so completely different.
Really?
I find it a lot harder.
Yeah.
A lot of it is because I'm doing all this other stuff. So right now I'm drafting a book that's a contracted and it's going to be out in the fall of 2022. So it's way, way, way in the future. I'm going to have two books released before this one that I'm writing right now. And of course, those two books that are come out before that, I have to copy. One of them's in copy edits that I have to start doing soon. So I have to put aside the drafting. And the other one, starting to get promotion calls. So there's always something else going on. And so it's almost impossible to just turn off my brain. I told you that I had that perfect storm of those 2 weeks when I
Yeah.
can write the Chai Factor. That's not something that can ever probably happen again for me, because there's always something else going on where I'm promoting the last book or the next book or editing or whatever. And I mean, I obviously I'm super, super grateful and I'm happy to be so busy, but it is a challenge to kind of like find it. You have to find a new system because that old system
Yeah.
that worked before isn't going to work anymore with all this other stuff going on.
That's fascinating. And like, do you feel like you can chase down any idea that you feel called to, or do you have to run it by people first and get them to like, how does that?
So I'm usually the kind of person that I can work. Like if I get an idea and it won't leave my head, then I can actually, I should say, I want to just work on it. I want
Yeah.
to explore it before giving it to anybody. Similar to how I don't want to show anyone my draft until it's completely done. I want to do that, but at the same time, I have to recognize that now this is a business. This isn't just a fun thing anymore. So I do like I'll send it to my agent. I'll send my agent ideas like which of these do you think I should work on? And obviously she knows the industry way better than me, and she's like, this is the one that seems more viable or whatever. So I wish I could just kind of like take this idea that's stuck in the back of my head and just work on it, but I have to be so much more cognizant of the outer workings and the market and all of that at the
Mm,
same time, which is still fine because I'm still working with what I want. It's just not, I can't just go off on my own tangent anymore.
yeah. I'm decided I've got two directions I want to go.
Yeah.
Like skip, jump. Um, but yeah, well, since you mentioned the agent first, maybe I'll chase that one down. Then I'm going to come back to characters
Okay.
and do they choose you or do you choose them? But your agent, so like the first draft, that all of that seemed to come pretty naturally and organically for you. How was the manuscript submission process and getting an agent?
Um, Getting an agent was relatively easy for me, and I say relatively because, of course, it's never exactly it's never completely smooth. The Chai Factor was the second book that I queried. So I had another book that I finished and had started querying it. And I'm never going to go back to that book. It wasn't right for me, and it was a great learning experience. And I think it was. I do actually think I didn't query it too soon. I do think that the book was the best I could do, and it was good enough to query. But I just don't think it was the best work that I could put out. It wasn't a rom-com. And
Yeah.
after writing the Chai Factor, I'm like, no, rom-com is where I need to be. I shouldn't try anything else. So that experience of that book, of course, did not sign an agent, which was fine. So the second book I queried is the Chai Factor, and I got an agent rather quickly for that one.
I hear that so many times from authors. It's like that first book just not quite landing, and the second one.
It's actually kind of hard for authors, I think, to know where their skills are. Like, I like to read. At the time, I really enjoyed reading those kind of like moody paranormal. So that's what that book was. It was like a moody paranormal. And I really loved reading it, and I really loved thinking of those stories. But when it came down to write it, it didn't suit my voice. The few little segments in the book where there was a little bit of humor, I had so much fun with that. And I had so much fun with the back and forth and the jokes. And I remember showing my husband, I'm like, listen to this. And I read him the excerpt. He's like, so what? And I'm like, it's so much fun to write. And it didn't occur to me that really I should be doing everything that way, that I should just focus on that. And I think it is harder for new writers to figure out where their strengths lie. And that once they find it, basically finding their voice, once they find it, then everything kind of, then all of a sudden I got an agent quickly, and then I got a book deal. So everything kind of fell into place.
Yeah. And it is so chippy and fast paced and fun. I really enjoyed reading Accidentally Engaged. That's the one I was reading. And so are you does that mean is rom-coms you're sticking with it, or is there any kind of like, one day I might try this, or like, I'm just curious about like genre and how you stick to a genre and that decision.
I think for now, definitely. So I have 2 YA books on contract too, and I don't see them as much as like rom-coms as my adult books. My adult books are rom-com; they're funny. But my YA books, I don't see them as much. I know other people think they're rom-coms, but I see them more as coming of age, like more of a contemporary romance, YA contemporary romance. So that is kind of a bit of a departure from the rom-com. But they're all still romance. They're all still romance heavy. I would love to go back and write the other kinds of stuff that I read. I would love to write a mystery one day. And that's one of those things that, again, that everyone's like, yeah, but your romances are selling well. I don't know if you should like necessarily move away from that. So maybe later, when my career is even more established, then I can do that. I would really like to write a mystery. But for now, I think I'm happy. Like, I've always wanted to write romance, so I'm happy that I'm in romance. But whether I stay funny or not, I don't know.
Yeah, and like, because you've experimented with other genres, I'm just curious, like, there might be, when I'm writing, there might be like a scene or a moment where and I'm like, I am just so like cringy about the whole thing. Like, is it like effortless for you, or do you like, is somebody going to think this is hot, or like, it's sort of intimate, right? To write romance, and it's super fun and flirtatious, but like, to be the person that puts themselves out there for everybody to go, this is what I find attractive, this is what I find sexy, like.
Totally. No, totally. I think it helps that I'm a romance reader, and I have been forever. You kind of do have to lean into the cheese factor there and just go with it. Obviously, the heat levels aside, so I don't write open door. Like, my sex scenes are closed door. For the most part, I like to say that the door is open just a crack, and each of my books is a little bit crack more. But still, I don't want to say I can't. I am not great at writing sex scenes, and that's the only reason actually I don't write them. It's not for any moral or other reason. I literally tried writing them, and I think that cringe factor was just too much for me. And I'm not saying that I don't like to read them, because I actually do like reading high heat stuff. but it's a very difficult thing to kind of separate yourself from the language to the emotions, and
Totally.
especially,
I don't think people
yeah.
give it enough credit. I think it's
Oh my
really hard.
goodness. Yeah, it is very, very hard. And I'm very, I like to think that I'm very inwardly focused on my characters about their emotions. I don't write action that well at all. At least I don't think I do. So and I mean, a sex scene, whether it's a very emotional scene or not, it is still an action scene. It's still arms and legs doing things. So,
Yeah.
so I think to have emotion, to have the emotion of a sex scene in an action moment is very difficult to do well without it becoming either too technical or too emotional.
Yeah.
Or so yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question there, but yeah, totally. That I think that the way to get over that is just to read a ton, and then it doesn't seem
Yeah.
strange anymore.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. So your novels are not just romance or rom-coms. They talk about culture clashes, and so I just want to come back to, like, I'm going to backtrack to the character questions. But so with the Chai Factory, you've got like a 30-year-old Muslim engineer who's set one rule for herself: no dating until her grad school thesis is done. I love this rule. I'm going to make it my daughter's rule. And of course, she's going to meet a guy who completely challenges her on that. And then in Accidentally Engaged, which was so fun, it follows a woman, Rina Manji, who fakes an engagement to the boy next door to enter a couples cooking contest. So I'm wondering, was there ever a question of, like, did you ever wonder whether your characters will be white or not white? Like, did you ever was that a process for you? Or was it like without question?
No, it was definitely a process for me. So those early manuscripts, I did not write South Asian characters when I first started writing. And a lot of people,
wow.
Yeah. So I did not, because I was a voracious reader, and I had never read a traditional modern Western romance that had South Asian characters. I'd never seen one. And I've been reading forever, and I was a very voracious reader, and I was like, it's not even something that I even thought about. I just thought that that's what people wanted, right? I grew up reading Sweet Valley Twins and the right, and it was always these perfect blonde white girls, and that was what romance was. And I didn't necessarily think about why that was wrong. I just didn't really think about it one way or another. I thought that's what it was. So I really started writing. And it was not South Asian characters. But again, like I said, I ended up moving through. So I'm moving through ideas and playing with ideas, and then I started writing people of color. I ended up writing a book that had a white lead and a South Asian love interest, but I still wasn't writing from the POV of the South Asian. And then I ended up talking to a few people, and I finally read a book by Sonali Dev, who is a very, very successful South Asian romance writer now. And I read a book by her. It was her first book. It was called The Bollywood Bride, and it was fantastic. And it was the first time I'd ever read a romance set in the US with South Asian characters. And it was like kind of shocking to me, because I was like, I didn't realize that publishers would have any interest in that. I thought that South Asian characters could happen in women's fiction or in like these torture immigrant stories, but not in a joyful romance where it's not about their immigrant pain or anything. It's more about falling in love. So when I read that book, and then I ended up meeting another South Asian author who is now actually a successful YA author. So I met her, and I started talking, and she kind of encouraged me. She kind of says that people need these stories. Just because they're not in existence now, it doesn't mean they won't be. And South Asians need to see themselves represented in every genre, including in romance. But also non-South Asians need to kind of have a glimpse into our lives. And also she kind of encouraged me saying that your stories will be better if you're writing it from a place you're familiar with, from a perspective that's closer to your own. And because I was just so new and starting out, I was like, okay, I'll try that. So The Chai Factor was the first book I wrote with a South Asian POV character, which is interesting because then, of course, like
Yeah.
that it was also the first rom-com I wrote, and it was the first book that I sold. But since then, of course, I'm like, no, I'm only writing South Asian characters now.
And it is like, and I'm like you, like that's just how my characters, and I'm like, I guess that's from all the books that we read. Like that's just where you go. And I flirted with it. And I believe one day I will write Latina characters, but I just feel like it works so beautifully with your story. And I think it makes it richer, like your friend said, like it makes it richer, it makes it more original, more unique. You really carve out your own space. But from a writer standpoint, it complicates things, or like at least that's what I make up, right? Like I have a story, I have my characters, and now I'm going to add this layer in, makes it like, I don't know, distracting, or I have all these stories about it. Something
it does kind of complicate things, and it also gives you a burden that you don't necessarily want. Like things are already kind of harder for people of color, and then to have to take on this extra burden of everybody thinking that I'm going to represent what they believe a South Asian Muslim woman would be like. And most of the time I'm not what people expect. My characters are not what people expect from South Asian Muslim characters.
Which is so cool.
I mean, I think it's great, and I would love, love there to be so many South Asian Muslim romance writers that nobody says this one's correct and this one's not. Because, I mean, I know a lot of South Asian Muslim people, and we're all very different. Yeah. So I really wish that there were so many writers writing these stories that nobody would say, well, that's not real, that one's real, that one's not real, because you wouldn't say that if there's that much diversity. Yes. But at the same time, it's that burden that I've kind of taken onto myself, that people expect me to represent my entire community, and I don't represent my community. I represent me, right? And also, that it's, some people will never pick up my book off the shelf because they know, they believe from the beginning that they will not be able to relate to it, because they are like how I used to be, that, well, romances are supposed to be with these white blonde ladies. Yes. So they won't pick it up. They'll think that book is for other people. So that's another burden that I'll always have on me. But at the same time, like the joys are fantastic. I love it when a reader says that, oh, your family looks like my family, or I'm so excited about seeing traditional food in there, or any of those things. And even non-South Asian readers, I love learning more about your culture. This was so amazing. It's so great to see this like cultural texture that's different, but the story is still relatable, and pretty much the story is just like any other romance, but the texture in the background is different.
Yeah, I love that. I love what you say, like, because I keep thinking about like, what I want to ask you is like, how did that affect, getting an agent? How did it affect getting an editor and a publisher, and, an adaptation, screen adaptation? Like, how did that impact every decision afterward? But what I'm hearing is just like the joy that comes from the reader connection, which is why we do this. Yeah. In the first place, right? Just for other people to see themselves in the story. So that's really cool.
But it definitely does. It definitely does affect along the way. I didn't have any trouble. Like, my agent is fantastic. I had no issues with her not being like, she didn't at any point ask me to pull back on any of the cultural aspects, or the opposite, or she didn't ask me to put more. Like, she's very comfortable with what I'm comfortable doing. And I've had the same experience with my editors. But I know that my career is different because I am writing South Asian Muslim characters. One of the things that people don't really think about is exactly what you were saying, those sub rights. So my book is available in Canada and in the US and in the UK and other English-speaking countries, English-speaking countries in Europe. But it's going to be available in Germany. It was translated into German, which is I'm super excited about, because that's my first translation. But I know other people that books were translated into so many more languages than that, that they were sold to like Sweden or Lithuania or anything like that. And it's one thing for here in Canada and the US for people to pick up the book with the brown people on the cover. And maybe it's one thing in the UK for that to happen. But as you get to other places in the world, it's not as normal. It's not as common. If people want to read, if somebody, for example, somewhere else wants to read a story set in North America, they're not going to think that brown people on the cover is that North American story that they're looking for. So subrights is an issue, that it's harder to sell subrights when you are not writing white characters, which is unfortunate. And then, like you said, film deals and all that, it's just that extra hurdle along the way over and over again.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it even started like, before I was even aware of what I was doing, because it's just been coming up lately, that's something I get to think about. But, something as basic as setting, like, do I set it in Toronto, or is that going to ruin all my opportunities of making it anywhere else? Right. So it's something that we get to think about. And my question also is, like, with everything going on right now with own voices, and it feels like a boom time. Like, the media would have us think that this is a boom time for anybody who's, of color that wants to get published or do anything. Like, is that an accurate portrayal of what you're feeling behind the scenes? Do you feel like the opportunities have blown up, or that you have maybe a better opportunity to carve out a space? Or is this all just like kind of, it looks good on Pinterest or on Instagram, but it's not quite reality?
I think that's an excellent question, and I really like that you asked that, because there is a perception right now that it's easier for us than it used to be, or anything. I think the reality is, right now it is possible for me to carve out a place for my career, when maybe 5 to 10 years ago it wasn't even a possibility. But now at least I'm here. But at the same time, when you see, for example, if you look at the book sales in Canada and the US, there's definitely a good number of people of color that are selling books, well. But if you look at the total number of books sold, it's still predominantly white writers, like by far predominantly white. So that handful of 5 people of color authors that are doing really well are the ones that everybody sees over and over again. And look, it's so easy to get a book deal if you're a person of color. Meanwhile, the 95% of book deals are still going to white authors. The other thing, especially, I don't know if this is true for other genres, but sales still aren't, for example, if there's a book that you see on Instagram over and over and over again, and it's like saturated and everything, that doesn't necessarily translate into that book actually selling well. This happens a lot in romance, where they're putting together a romance list of the 10 best books of 2021. And they're like, the people putting together the list, they want to be diverse and they want to be representative. So they'll put a good number of people of color on that list. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the average reader is going to look at that list and then go buy those people of color books. Because the average reader might still be in that mentality, well, romance is for white people, or romance looks like this, they need to look like me. So showing up on the lists, those lists are curated. Those lists, even the New York Times bestseller list is a curated list for the most part. So those lists are put together, and it's fabulous to see diversity in it. But you can't assume that just because you see that book over and over again, that those images have translated into sales. And then and it's kind of heartbreaking, because especially when you see like some of my marginalized writer friends, whether they be LGBTQ plus or people of color, some of them will say, like, it's so great to see my book everywhere. I really wish it could translate it into the sales, versus my other friend who doesn't get the media attention but has the sales. So it is very interesting.
Very, very interesting. But good to hear that in the business that it didn't hinder you at all, or you didn't feel
I've been super, super lucky. And I know a lot of people that have had issues with editors or agents, and knock on wood, it hasn't happened to me yet. My agents and my editors have all been absolutely super supportive of me. And I don't know, obviously I don't know why my book ever gets rejected. Obviously I got rejected from a lot of different agents and a lot of editors. And of course I'll never really know why that rejection happened. But I have never had anyone tell me it was because we already have a brown author, or the story won't resonate here, whatever. I've never had anyone tell me that. So which is great.
And now, was from agent to editor, was that also, was that pretty quick, or did you have to wait years, or like how?
Chai Factor
I find the editing
sold,
process really
yeah,
fascinating. I'm actually going to interview an editor today, but it will be published next week. So I'm just like, I can't wait to hear more about
yes,
this.
yes. Chai Factor sold to Chai Factor was published by a Canadian publisher, and we ended up selling that. I think it was 6 months on submission, and then it wasn't bad at the time. It felt really long, and I know that that was then, and things are slower now than they were then. But I thought it was pretty good. It wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
My next book sold very quickly, but that kind of made sense because I'd already had I had a book behind me, and then my YA also sold very quickly. But again, that made sense because
Yeah.
I was more established at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would love to hear. I mean, rom-coms, and as you teach it as well, right?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it does rely on, to a certain extent, the reader wants to know what's coming. You know what I mean? They kind of want to, and it gets to be original and fresh and unique. And I'm just curious about, like, what have you learned about writing romantic comedies, and what can you share with us today as far as like romance?
So the biggest advice I give when I teach rom-coms is to lower your inhibitions and just be weird. Rom-coms are supposed to be,
Great
yeah.
advice. I love
Yes.
that.
Rom-coms are supposed to be funny, and maybe you won't. A lot of times, the biggest issue I have with when books are labeled rom-coms is when they're not actually funny. And I don't think there's anything wrong with calling a book a contemporary romance or calling it just a romance. But a lot of times publishers, because rom-coms are hot and they're selling, so publishers will slap that rom-com label on it if there's one joke in it. And this is a pet peeve of mine. Like when I want to write a rom-com, I think the comedy should be as important as the romance.
Okay.
So I say just be weird, put the weird, like the slapstick and all those other things in there. But then we also have to remember the biggest thing I think that I talk to my students about when I'm teaching this is that we also have to remember that the reader has to fall in love with the characters. That's why we write. That's why we read romance, is so that we can feel all those feelings with the characters. And sometimes you can go too far with the comedy that the characters are no longer lovable. I guess they're no longer someone that the reader can fall in love with. So it's a balance to make sure that your character can still be, I don't like the word relatable, empathetic. The character can still be empathetic enough so that the reader can fall in love with them as they fall in love with each other. But then we also have to remember that it's supposed to be funny. It's not supposed to be just a one-liner here and there, and the rest of it is just a flat romance. Which again, there's nothing wrong with writing a romance. It doesn't have to be a rom-com.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Those are two brilliant pieces of advice. I really, really love that. Oh, this is so great. This is really great. I really love this interview. Very juicy. So you have you had a few books coming out. You've got like 3 books coming out. Tell me about what you want to share about those.
Yes. So my next book is Tahira in Bloom, and that's my YA debut. So it's my first YA book. It's coming out in November 1st. I'm really, really excited about it. It's about a teenage fashion designer who loses an internship that she really needs for her fashion school application. So she has no choice but to go to like this teeny tiny town in Ontario, and she's working at her aunt's boutique because it's the only fashion job she could get. So she's in this little tiny town. She's a real city girl, and she is obviously obsessed with fashion. And the boy next door is this flower obsessed. He's like obsessed with flowers and plants and gardening. And she butts heads with him. She does not get along with him. But of course, because it's a romance, they get pushed together. She ends up entering a flower sculpture contest that has clout with the fashion scene. So she asks him to help her teach her about flowers. So together they learn about flowers and sculpture. So it's about art and fashion and flowers, obviously.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about that. That's coming out in November. And then in March, I have my next adult rom-com. So that is called Camilla Knows Best. And it's actually a Jane Austen retelling. So it's Emma It's Emma in a South Asian Muslim community in Toronto. So it's more
Do
similar
you
to
have a film rights
Accidentally
for that one? Because that's going to be a movie for sure.
That, yeah, I'm super excited about it. That it's kind of similar to Accidentally Engaged. There's no characters overlap or anything. It's completely standalone, but it's that similar kind of rom-com-y feel to it. Except I'm so excited to have like the Jane Austen Easter eggs in there and all that stuff. So that'll be fun. So those two are the ones that are coming out next, and then I'm working on another YA that will be out next fall. So 2022 fall, which I'm still working on it. I don't even know what it's about right now because I'm drafting it.
I love it. Well, Farah, thank you so much. This was such a fun interview, and thank you for sharing and just being really open about, your process and what's come up for you. It's been really great having you on the show.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you soon. Bye.